Let's bring in Ebru Şalcıoğlu, who joins me now for more from Istanbul. She is a clinical psychologist at the Center for Behavioral Studies and Therapies. Ebru, good to have you on the show. For millions that are watching some of these unbelievable images of rescue efforts after 100, 110, 120 hours, it is a huge source of relief, happiness, and joy. But the survivors, I must imagine, must be in some sort of extreme state of shock. And it's not just physical.
No, definitely. It's not only physical, it's also very emotional and psychological. There are so many stressors in an earthquake region. That there are, first of all, they are exposed to very violent shock. The tremors of the initial shock are very frightening, and they were exposed to life-threatening events such as collapse of the buildings, being trapped under the rubble. Also, the extreme weather conditions. It was extremely cold there. They were exposed to somewhat distressing scenes. People trapped under rubble. And perhaps some dead bodies. They lost close ones, and they also lost their resources. And they're experiencing very stressful life events right now. And there is an uncertainty about what to do and how the future is going to unfold. And on top of everything, there are ongoing aftershocks. So in this multitude of stresses, people have some emotional reactions that we consider normal, but if they continue in the long term, they can become chronic. What are they? First of all, there is fear. Many people are very much afraid of another earthquake happening again. They are constantly experiencing the aftershocks, and the aftershocks fuel more fear in people because they carry the risk of collapse of new buildings and more damage and more loss of life. And they experience anxiety about the future, what's going to happen in their life, how they're going to rebuild their life, how the infrastructure is going to rebuild again. So this is very anxiety provoking. Although there are some hopeful news about people trapped under rubble, but there is also helplessness because many people feel helpless when they watch rescue efforts. Many people are trapped under the rubble and they are still being they wait to be rescued or pulled from the rubble. So it's just sense of helplessness and guilt at the same time, because many people are unable to do anything, to take any action, to offer some form of help. So, and some people experience survival guilt because they survive, but their close ones or the people they know, they don't live anymore, and this brings about guilt in many people. I hear from people in the earthquake region saying that I have difficulty eating or sleeping, and I feel guilty because others cannot eat and sleep anymore. And of course, anger after the disasters. Anger is very common because of the magnitude of the disaster and the collapse of buildings and loss of lives. People also feel angry.
Ebru, I mean, some very interesting points that you allude to, whether it's lingering anxiety or I think it was survival guilt, and I'll try to get into that. But talk to us about how important it is that the necessary sort of psycho and social support be given. And I'm not just talking about the people that have been pulled from underneath the rubble, but the immediate survivors. So we're talking 13.5 million people. I mean, the UN puts this number at 23 million in terms of how they deal with this crisis.
Definitely, because experiencing an earthquake is very frightening. So the immediate survivors are all survivors in the region, in all provinces. So everybody have been traumatized by this earthquake. But whether the traumatic effects will be lingering or not, it will depend on multitude of factors. In the acute phase, psychological support is mostly in the form of social support. People go there and help other people, offer very tangible support. They help each other to cope with the acute stressors or difficulties of life in the early aftermath of the disaster. So people receiving this kind of social support, they also feel psychologically supported. Direct psychological support is difficult right now because these emotions are very prevalent and they are needed because those people who are traumatized, they need to process certain emotions so that they can evolve and they can enter the natural recovery process. So it is very important here to just help survivors to build their lives in the early aftermath and normalize the emotions, these reactions, and reassure them that with time, many people will actually recover from these effects. So in some people, definitely it's going to be, they are going to be chronic. In our studies after the 1999 earthquake in Turkey, we screened earthquake survivors for the most common psychological problem that may develop after traumatic events, namely PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in all of our studies conducted 1 to 4 years after the trauma, after the earthquake, 40% of the survivors had this problem. So it's not a negligible number, but 60% actually they recovered during the natural recovery process. So, but many people will recover, but a significant proportion will need psychological help in the long term.
Ebru, when you sort of break down the composition of the survivors that are being pulled out from the collapsed buildings, one thing that is actually striking is just the large chunk or the large portion of infants, toddlers, babies. Throughout our coverage, I've come to an understanding that they are extremely resilient. But I'm wondering, because I would assume that children, toddlers, and babies, they're at a different part of the psychological development stage. Therefore, their psychological support needs would be different when you compare them to adults, let's say.
Interestingly, children, adolescents, and adults show similar reactions in the aftermath of an earthquake or any other trauma event. They also develop fear and anxiety problems. They have difficulty sleeping. They actually play compulsively some plays that resemble part of earthquake. Their experiences. So these reactions are also very common in adults. So psychological support, or I prefer to say a psychological help, should be given in a similar form to adults, children, and adolescents. Interestingly enough, some studies show that older age is a risk factor for chronic traumatic stress reactions in earthquake survivors. So perhaps younger age is protective in some cases. But here there are things that families or parents can do for those children, or children who are left without their parents, who lost their parents and they are taking under care. They should be actually reassured that they are safe and they have people around them that they can rely on. Their parents should convey this message and ensure them their safety and be close to them both emotionally and physically. And also this should be done in care agencies that offer support to these children.
Ebru, I'm not sure if enough research has been done with what I'm going to ask you, but I do want to sort of touch upon this issue. We're dealing with a tragedy for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But when you look sort of at some of the images that are emerging on social media, you see cats, you see dogs. In one instance, I was watching a video of a disabled adolescent stuck with, in a triangle of life in between slabs of concrete, and he had his pet bird with him there. I saw cows buried up to their neck in rubble, and people were feeding them water. Animals must be going through some sort of similar emotions and trauma as well.
Well, most probably, this question is more for an ethologist, I think, but I can make some hypotheses. Animals show similar reactions to emotional reactions or stress reactions as do humans when they are faced with anxiety-provoking events or traumatic events. We know that from experimental research in laboratories, because we actually, to understand human psychological reactions, we use animals. Actually, we study them in the laboratory, and when we induce stress or when there is a traumatic stressor they are exposed to, they develop similar problems, traumatic stress problems. So they are also fear, they are also afraid probably, and they are probably anxious of any harm. But animals have something that protects them. Actually, they have more acute senses, so they can sense and perceive danger more quickly, and they can take protective measures to self-preserve. This is rather different than human beings. I'm going to make a point here. It is interesting that you asked. One of the long-term psychological reactions will be prolonged grief in earthquake survivors. Grief because they lost their loved ones very suddenly. They were not expecting this, and it's going to be difficult for them to adjust to this loss. So many of them will grieve in a very long period of time. They will show some traumatic grief reactions. Some people may be very ashamed of showing these reactions, but they will be experiencing them if they lost their pets. We know that pet loss is also a very traumatic experience for human beings, because they become friends or sometimes children to their caregivers. And they may also, human beings can develop grief reactions when they lose pets. So, but I don't know, in the midst of everything, many people will be ashamed of showing their grief reactions with respect to their loved pets.
Ebru Şalcıoğlu, I very much enjoyed talking to you. Some fascinating subjects and some important issues that need to be dealt with in the medium to long term. Thank you very much for joining us here in our continuing coverage.
Thank you.